and also pardoning any nonviolent drug offenders on 420, a very strategic date as well. Do you have any plans in place to help these people get into the cannabis industry? Because the industry that we're seeing grow so much right now is blocking out people who have been convicted from this same product, the same thing that has been classified as a drug in our country.
Yeah, I've seen proposals on the table to help channel the economic gains from the cannabis industry to neighborhoods that have been victimized by our drug laws over the last number of years. I'm supportive of those proposals. I mean, the main thing we can do, in my opinion, is put $1,000 a month into people's hands. And then if you come out of prison, you're like, wow, things sure have changed since I went to jail. You know, like they were giving out dividends when I went in, and now that I'm out. President Yang making it happen. So if there are ways that we can structurally channel those benefits, those economic benefits, to communities that have been hurt by the drug laws, I'd be all for it. I've seen those proposals, and I'm very supportive of them.
A great many people who voted for Donald Trump would be receptive to the idea that automation is getting rid of their jobs. But they also believe that immigration, both legal and illegal, is causing their jobs to either become redundant or that immigrants will work for less or do jobs Americans won't do. How would you reach the Trump voter who puts a greater emphasis on immigration harming their livelihood than automation?
Well, I've been campaigning around the country for the last number of months. And when I say it is not immigrants, it is technology that's causing these dislocations. Most every group of Americans I've spoken to agrees with that. There's no one that's like, no, I refuse to accept that it's robots. And I use real examples. I say, look, if you go to an American factory, you're not going to see wall-to-wall immigrants. You're going to see wall-to-wall robot arms and machines. And the reason why so many malls and stores are closing is that Amazon's sucking up $20 billion in commerce every year. And if you go to an Amazon fulfillment center, again, it's going to be wall-to-wall robots and machines. So I just...
Andrew, do you think it's possible to regain Americans' trust in journalism?
I think it's not only possible, I think it's vital. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is that over 1,200 local newspapers have gone out of business over the last number of years, because those local newspapers used to rely upon classified ads for their revenue, and then all those classified ads went to Craigslist online, and then they never got replaced, and so all these newspapers went out of business. So studies have shown that if you don't have a newspaper in your community, then voters tend to become more polarized, which makes sense, because if you're not getting any information about what's going on in your town, then you just tend to vote along party lines. So if you believe in an informed democracy, then you have to believe in journalism. So I have several pro-journalism plans as president. Number one, I would put together a journalism fund to help local papers transition, because a lot of these communities could support a local newspaper as a nonprofit or a model that's not meant to make people a lot of money, but the community would embrace just having that paper there. And you can use town libraries as a hub, because many town libraries already have bulletin boards that the communities go to see what's going on. So that's number one. Number two is in a new American Journalism Fellows program, where we just pay to have a journalist in every congressional district with the same thinking, which is, look, if people are going to elect a congressperson in a community, then you need some kind of journalism there so that people know what they're voting for. So I would fund it from the federal government, just say, look, this is just essentially funding for a journalist in your community, free and clear of the local papers that are already there. Because I've been now to communities around the country, and as a politician, I have to say, you feel like a jerk, because you go to Iowa or New Hampshire and you say, hey, talk about me, spread the word about me to your the people in your state. And then meanwhile, that reporter is like living on a salary that's going down and down and down. They're worried about losing their job. And then you feel like, wow, I'm asking you to help me do my job, and like, who's going to help you do yours? So as a society, we have to not only restore trust in journalism, we have to see it as a vital public function if we're going to believe in democracy. And so to me, journalism is something that I would not just try and restore trust in, I would invest in. And I would love to go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner as president, because then it would actually be fun again. Unlike Donald Trump, who's like villainizing these people, it's like, let's have a good time. I mean, like, that's what that night seems to.
With a view to the future, how do you plan to win over the older voting demographic?
Well, I've been meeting with Americans around the country, and it doesn't matter if you're young or old, where you're experiencing the fact that our economy has become increasingly difficult for more and more families. And so, to me, it's independent of age, really, the punitive nature of our economy. I meet middle-aged Americans around the country who are incredibly fed up, and they see that our government has become unresponsive and out of touch. I don't know what the average age is of people who are supporting my campaign. It does seem like I'm very popular among young people. I'm at like 9% among 18 to 29. But when I go to a rally that we have, it's actually a very, very diverse group of Americans, certainly by age and by gender and by every other demographic or characteristic.
Probably have a hell of a time getting marijuana legalization through Congress, but as president, you could get marijuana descheduled off of Schedule 1 of the DEA scheduling, where it's considered it has no medicinal value and a high risk of addiction. If you were president, would you instruct your attorney general to reclassify marijuana?
Yes, I agree with you. That's the first step. It's the most straightforward, where if you just get it off the controlled substances list, then all of a sudden there is an enforcement at the federal level. I actually disagree that it's going to be difficult to get it through Congress because the vast majority of Americans at this point support legalizing marijuana. A lot of people have friends and relatives that are using it for medicinal purposes, and it's a much safer approach than, frankly, a lot of the opiates that people are using to manage pain.
Of autonomy at the local level.
Yes.
How would you execute that? How would you get every police officer in the U.S. wearing a body camera?
Well, you're right that there are many, many local agencies, and it's not necessarily the case that even as president, I could say every police officer in every agency is going to have a body camera. But what you can do at the federal level is you can say it is funded fully. And we're not talking about that mammoth an amount of money. We're talking about maybe several $1 billion would be enough to buy a camera for every police officer in the country. And then if you're a police department, you're literally like, well, the feds have funded this. And so we don't like the idea of cameras so much that we're going to turn down free cameras for our officers. That's going to be a very hard argument for municipal departments to make. And then if you're a citizen of that town, you're like, wait a minute, they're like literally free cameras that you guys are turning down? Like, what are you guys doing over there? So you could get significant adoption around the country if you just foot the bill. And from a public standpoint, I think we don't. I'm a science guy, but you don't need to be a scientist to know that the last 4 years have been the 4 warmest years in recorded history. I mean, climate change is becoming a greater and greater threat. Now, to me, financial insecurity and addressing climate change are actually tied together. Because if you're living in a country where 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, they're not sure whether they're going to be able to pay their bills, and 57% can't afford an unexpected $500 bill, then if you go to those Americans and say, hey, we really need to focus on climate change, a lot of them will say, I cannot pay my bills. The penguins will have to wait in line. And that seems obnoxious, but that's just the way a lot of people are going to react because we have this mindset of scarcity that has swept our country. It's one reason why we're starting to see ourselves so polarized. So if we have a dividend in place for Americans and everyone's getting $1,000 a month, then I'm a science guy, but you don't need to be a scientist to know that the last 4 years have been the 4 warmest years in recorded history. I mean, climate change is becoming a greater and greater threat. Now, to me, financial insecurity and addressing climate change are actually tied together. Because if you're living in a country where 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, they're not sure whether they're going to be able to pay their bills, and 57% can't afford an unexpected $500 bill, then if you go to those Americans and say, hey, we really need to focus on climate change, a lot of them will say, I cannot pay my bills. The penguins will have to wait in line. And that seems obnoxious, but that's just the way a lot of people are going to react because we have this mindset of scarcity that has swept our country. It's one reason why we're starting to see ourselves so polarized. So if we have a dividend in place for Americans and everyone's getting $1,000 a month, then
Your rivals are wrong?
So this is going to sound very politician-y, but I was in Iowa with this high school student who told me a story about how his classmates have fentanyl patches on their arms because they're already addicted to opiates. And many of them would not seek treatment because they know it's against the law to be using these drugs. And he said, what can we do? And this really hit home to me because I was like, what can we do? This guy's literally like walking around his high school and his like friends are addicted to opiates. Now, I feel very, very strongly about this because the government was delinquent in allowing the opiate crisis to get started in the first place. The feds turned a blind eye when Purdue Pharma started dispensing OxyContin prescriptions all over the country, saying it's this non-addictive wonder drug, when instead it was terribly addictive. And eventually, Purdue Pharma paid a fine of $635 million, which sounds like a ton, until you realize they made $30 billion on OxyContin. They got a 2% fine, and now the Sackler family, the owners of Purdue Pharma, are among the 20 richest families in the country. Think about that. That's blood money, because now we have 8 Americans dying of drug overdoses every hour in this country. So if you're a fair society and you look around and say, wait a minute, there's a plague killing thousands of Americans every year that we helped cause, or at least did not do enough to protect our people from, then the least you can do is go to those people and say, look, if you're struggling with addiction, our first priority is to get you treatment and not bring you to a prison cell. And that opens up the avenue for more of our citizens to say, look, I need help. And then we can get resources into their hands. When other countries have decriminalized these drugs, they've seen a drop in both overdose rates and usage rates. And this is a public health crisis of the highest order. We have to be pulling out all the stops. It's very difficult administratively to have a universal basic income vary by geography, because the fact is people move around, and the last thing you want is a situation where people are like saying, oh, I live in New York, and then really they're like heading off to other parts of the country that are lower cost, which is something that a lot of Americans would do, honestly, if you were to scale it depending upon the cost of living. So $1,000 a month, free and clear for everyone, is much easier to administer. And it's also the case that people who live in a very expensive place like New York City, where we are right now, we make a decision to live here largely because we think we can access better opportunities. And so it doesn't seem fair to say, not only are you going to live someplace where you can access better opportunities, but we're also going to give you more money to account for the fact it's expensive. Now, to the second part of your question, it is messed up when Americans are working full-time and can't make ends meet. And so $1,000 a month does not solve the problem entirely in a place like Manhattan, but $1,000 a month does give us all more dynamism and flexibility. And so when I think Planned Parenthood, I think women's reproductive rights. And certainly if there's an organization that's helping women navigate childbearing, I think that's very, very positive. In terms of women's reproductive rights, I'm on the record saying that as a man running for president, I feel like it should be up to women what women want to do in that arena. And I have a feeling we know where women will come out. I'm also on the record saying if men became pregnant, we'd have very different standards in this society. If you can imagine a society where men became pregnant, like there'd be a very, very different conversation about reproductive rights. So I'm a fan of Planned Parenthood because it seems to get resources into the hands of women at a very crucial point. And it's something that, to me, we should be applauding.
Among Democrats is whether or not to support school choice, whether or not people who are in a specific zip code where the school is underperforming and they have access to vouchers or some other mechanism that allows them to attend a different school that is a better fit for their family. Where do you stand on that?
So there are excellent charter schools and there are not so excellent charter schools. There are excellent public schools and not so excellent public schools. So to me, it's not so much the type of school, it's whether or not the school is good or bad. So to the extent that some districts want choice in terms of the types of schools they have in their communities, I am for that. So generally speaking, I'm for communities having more choices about the schools that their kids attend. As a parent myself, I know I would be very, very frustrated if I did not have any recourse, and that like if, let's say my public school was not a good one and my kid was going there, and that there was some person who wanted a charter school there and they were prohibited from doing so, I would find that very, very problematic.
Follow-up question about the Freedom Dividend. How do you envision that working with government assistance programs that are in place now? Would it be in conjunction or would it be a replacement for that?
So the Freedom Dividend would be universal. Everyone gets it, but it's opt-in. And if you opt in, then you're then foregoing benefits from certain existing programs. So the goal is to make no one's life worse. The last thing I would ever do is take benefits away from an American or a family of Americans that need it to meet their monthly needs. I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, we're going to get rid of it all and turn it into cash. What we do is we create the dividend, and then people can choose which they'd prefer. And over time, we'd see that the dividend ends up hopefully providing a positive set of incentives so that if people flourish, then they still keep the dividend, whereas some of our current programs, unfortunately, do have a disincentive where if you do better, then you get less over time.
So obviously there's going to be a lot of pushback to any gun regulations that are proposed. The Republican Party is pretty much a non-starter. How would you get these through Congress?
So this is something where, again, I think Congress and the people are actually misaligned because the vast majority of Americans support common sense gun legislation. We do have to compromise with the legislators who are looking out for their citizens who feel very, very strongly about the Second Amendment rights. But there is zone for agreement. I'm convinced of it because I've talked to people who are very passionate about gun ownership, but even they recognize that there is something that needs to be done to help make Americans feel like this supply of deadly weapons is under control.
Our next question comes from David, who is a freelance writer who has a question about the Federal Reserve.
Hello, Mr. Yang. Thank
Hi,
you.
David.
Hi. Serious questions have been raised about the impartiality of many decisions the Federal Reserve's made over several administrations. As such, there have been repeated bipartisan calls for increased transparency through repeal of existing restrictions on the ability of the Comptroller General to comprehensively audit the Fed. Would you support such a bill? And were it to reach your desk as president, would you sign it?
You can put me in the school of thought that the Federal Reserve should be free of the government and depoliticized to the extent possible. And having like this cudgel where it's like, hey, do things that I like, or else we're going to do things that you don't like, strikes me as the wrong approach. There has to be some sort of independence from political considerations, or you would legitimately have presidents just being like, hey, my numbers are down. You know what we need? We need you to lower interest rates so that the economy looks better for my real
critical systems.
This is one thing I really thought Donald Trump would get right. You know, he gets elected and you're like, well, at least he's going to build a bunch of stuff and then put his name on it. And I would accept driving over Trump Bridge if there was a new bridge. I'd be like, well, you know, like I'll take it for a new bridge. But he couldn't even get that right. That unfortunately, we're still going to have to do it ourselves after we get that guy out of office in 2020. And so the plan is to go to the American people. The fact is, right now, infrastructure investment is wildly popular. Everyone knows that we're living on investments from decades past, that our highways and bridges are crumbling and becoming dangerous. And the wonderful thing about infrastructure investment is that it actually pays off, where if you invest a certain amount of money into infrastructure, you know that over time you'll actually get that money back. So this is going to be something that I believe that we're going to have bipartisan support for when I'm president, and this is a major lost opportunity from the current administration.
Concerns among U.S. companies and China, and why would you keep or remove the current tariffs that have been imposed by Trump if China does not change its policies?
So if you look at the U.S.-China relationship, I think intellectual property is certainly one of the most important considerations, where U.S. companies are losing the tunes of billions of dollars because of China's companies essentially just taking intellectual property, software in particular. So the question is, how can we change that? And tariffs, to me, are a really imperfect tool. Again, I was just in Iowa. I hate to say that, but I was just in Iowa, and the farmers and businesses there are furious because they voted for Donald Trump by almost 10% in Iowa, and then the farmers have seen their business relationships with various other countries just wither and die because of the tariffs. And a farmer actually said to me just last week in Iowa, he said, I spent 6 years building up a relationship with a particular company in China. Now that relationship. So, free college is something that I'm for the spirit of, because people shouldn't be going to college and having these crazy debt loads that young people have today. You know, we're up to 1.5 trillion in student loan debt, and it's causing many of our young people to make very, very different choices. I had student loan debt myself for a long time in my 20s. That said, about 33% of Americans graduate from college. So if we say, hey, college is now free, that's something that's going to help the top third of the population. And that level of 33% has been more or less stable for a long time. It's not like it's going to go from 33% to 65%. It's not happening. And we know that in part because the 6-year completion rate from college right now is only 59%. That is 41% of people who start are dropping out without having graduated within 6 years. So right now we have a lot of people that are heading to college that it's not a great fit for. And making it free is helpful, but it's helpful only for that. So free college is something that I'm for the spirit of, because people shouldn't be going to college and having these crazy debt loads that young people have today. We're up to 1.5 trillion in student loan debt, and it's causing many of our young people to make very, very different choices. I had student loan debt myself for a long time in my 20s. That said, about 33% of Americans graduate from college. So if we say, hey, college is now free, that's something that's going to help the top third of the population. And that level of 33% has been more or less stable. The immigration system is not serving their interests. I'm obviously the son, well, maybe not obviously, but I'm the son of immigrants. And so I naturally believe that immigrants are positive for our economy and our society. Like, the immigrants add dynamism in many, many ways, both economically and culturally. And so when I talk to Americans who do have that sentiment, I do express to them, look, the facts indicated is not immigrants that are causing the problems that you're most concerned about. And for the most part, they've found that compelling. Like most of you, when I interact with these internet companies, there's some disclaimer, and I just hit agree so I can use their service. It's like no one reads that stuff. It's boilerplate. But the fact is that our data actually has significant commercial value. And this is particularly true in certain industries like healthcare, where your data can get sold and resold for literally hundreds of dollars, and you never know about it. So to me, it does not seem fair that companies are benefiting to the tune of hundreds, perhaps even thousands of dollars per year on our data, and we barely know about it. Sometimes they actually make mistakes where our data gets actually accessed by some bad actor, and then most of the time we don't even know about it, or if we do know about it, we get some email saying, hey, you might want to change your passwords because we might have made a mistake there. So there's a little bit of a Wild West going on. And a lot of Americans will choose convenience first and foremost, but if we do choose convenience, then we deserve at least some sliver of the economic value that our data is creating. And so the goal is to create like a set of preferences that we can express, and then if we say, look, you can have my data, but if you commercialize that data to the tune of thousands of dollars a year, you at least need to send me a little bit of that money. And that's going to be one of my goals as president, is to make our data our own, and if we choose to share it, then at least we should get some share of the value.
Hello, Andrew. My question is, what are your views on the rise of nationalism and populism as a threat to democracy in Europe and Latin America?
Well, congratulations on being a citizen. I know it's been a long time, but I still feel like it's awesome when great people become Americans. I mean, the rise of nationalism and populism, I mean, it's happening here in the US, it's happening around the world, and there are a lot of forces that are coming together to accelerate it. So one is certainly climate change. If you have lower crop yields and people moving for better opportunities, then that can cause dislocation and increased populist pressures. A lot of it is, frankly, immigration in different environments, certainly in parts of Europe where people have been migrating, and then formerly very open and generous societies have become more closed. So the US is also part of this. Like, we can see our own society being buffeted by some of the same forces. And this is one of the major institutional crises of this time. Now, for better or for worse, many of these societies are democracies, and we need to listen to our people. And so the fact that Brexit happened, as one example, I mean, that was a shock to many. But you have to pay heed. If you're a democracy and the majority of your citizens come out in a certain direction, instead of just questioning it as irrational, you have to say, well, how the heck did that happen? So these are some of the big challenges. I don't have any quick or easy answers, but I will say, unfortunately, that climate change is a big part of it. And it's one reason why we have to invest massive resources to try and mitigate the worst effects of climate change in particular. I think that we're going to need some new approaches, certainly, to the migrant crises that are happening around the world. It's a great question. I mean, I think that committing a crime should not mean you're a non-citizen and cannot vote. So the threshold I've come up with is that if you have deprived someone else of their right to vote, then you should not have the right to vote, like as someone who's incarcerated. So as long as it's fallen short of that, then people who are in jail should have the right to vote, because presumably they're going to come out of jail and rejoin society. And studies have shown that if you vote and you're formerly incarcerated citizen, you're actually less likely to commit a crime and go back to jail. So if that's the case, we should be applauding anyone who votes because it means that they feel like they're part of society and will be less likely to go back to jail when they're out.
So just to be clear, you're basically saying just short of murder, anyone who's incarcerated should have the right to vote?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Study as it pertains to universal basic income.
Well, if you look at what happened in the 60s and 70s, the American government, this is going to sound far out or too good to be true, but the American government just started giving money out to various people in various communities to start measuring effects. And when you're talking about a change this massive throughout the economy, then it makes sense just to get some more data and information. I'm a firm believer in universal basic income, where if I had a choice between either just like pull the lever and start giving the money out to everyone in the country as soon as possible, that's the path that I would choose. But when you're dealing with getting something through the legislative process, people are going to rightfully expect to have a certain amount of information that they can rely upon before making
And a great many of your Democratic competitors think impeachment is the way to go. Do you?
Well, as someone running for president, it's my job to beat Donald Trump at the ballot box, and I think the way to do that is by solving the problems that got him elected. It's Congress's job to decide whether or not he should be impeached. So I'm going to do my job, and I'm going to let Congress do theirs.
So you don't take a position whether or not Trump should be impeached?
Well, for better or for worse, I've been a little bit too busy to dig through the Mueller report. You know, I mean, it's 448 pages or something like that.
You should read us. We've done plenty of coverage on it.
I know, so I have read summaries. And while there have certainly been actions that Donald Trump have taken that I think are really objectionable and perhaps impeachable, to me, it's Congress's responsibility to do their job and make that determination. Thanks for the question, Lee. So there are about 300 million firearms in this country right now, almost one for every man, woman, and child. We're the most heavily armed society in the history of the world. And so I'm for treating firearm sales much like the way we treat vehicle sales, where you get tested and licensed for buying a car or truck because they can kill people. Firearms can kill people too, and we should be testing and licensing to the extent possible. So I'm for common sense gun safety legislation, and I'm very much for a federal gun buyback. I mean, under President Yang, we'd be like, hey, anyone who wants to give us your gun, like, we've got the money for you, because anything we can do that to decrease the supply would be great. I would also be for investing in smart gun technology and making those upgrades complementary to gun owners, so you could have your own fancy gun that only you can fire, and that makes us all safer, because then if that gun gets into someone's hands or a kid's hands, thank you. It's a great question. I sat down with the folks who are developing AI in Silicon Valley. And we have to look around in terms of the global landscape. We're competing with China in AI, and China actually has a number of structural advantages. One is that they have access to more data because they have a more lax attitude about their own privacy. And two, they have a federal government, or the Chinese government, that's putting billions of dollars into computing infrastructure and resources. And when I met with the folks in Silicon Valley, they looked at me and they said, look, we're ready to spend $1, $2, $5 billion on this, but we can't match what the Chinese are doing. So what I said to the folks in Silicon Valley was that, look, you'll have a partner in President Yang. I'm going to try and help maintain America's global competitiveness in AI by putting real resources to help support our industry leaders. But in return, you have to do something for us, which is you have to accept that we need to have some information and not oversight, but at least an open line of communication so that we're aware of the changes that AI could wreak around the country. And what concerns me is that you don't need artificial general intelligence, which is perhaps years or decades away, to get rid of hundreds of thousands of call center jobs or truck driving jobs. That's not what you think of as AI in a science fiction sort, where it's not like smart, but it's smart enough to do the work that many Americans do right now. So I'm less concerned about what you'd consider the science fiction scenario and more concerned about the immediate economic effects. But I think that there is a balance we can strike as the federal government to be a partner to industry leaders while also making the public's concerns more prevalent in their thought process and considerations.
Reparations for descendants of slaves.
So I 100% agree that we owe a great, great debt to descendants of slaves. And I've read Ta-Nehisi Coates' and his writing on this is very, very compelling. Now, happily, the freedom dividend would be a bigger boost for communities that have lower access to education and resources, which right now, unfortunately, does include African American communities. I think it's a great first step towards helping strengthen our families and communities across the board. And then we should look independently at the question of reparations. There's a bill in Congress right now that is meant to explore what that might look like. And that's the sort of thing we should be doing. I'm supportive of that bill. And I certainly wouldn't put my judgment ahead of the people that are going to be studying it directly.
Real quick, reparations has become a big issue among 2020 candidates. Another one that's popped up very recently, surprisingly, is whether or not incarcerated people should have the right to vote. Do you have a position on that?
And very timely. Joseph is asking, considering the news that we've seen today, what is your position surrounding the political atmosphere of Venezuela?
Yeah, so Venezuela is a humanitarian crisis that's now, unfortunately, degenerating into a failed state, perhaps. And my overall position on America's intervention in foreign affairs is that we should not be making other countries' choices for them, and we should not be intervening militarily unless it's in our vital national interest. So to the extent that we can help make things easier for the Venezuelan people who are going through really this like an incredible economic turmoil, we should do so. Anything short of force. Hopefully the Venezuelan people will make it clear that Maduro is not the leader that they want, and that we'll be able to support the new leader as he takes power. That's the goal, but we should not be intervening militarily. We've done that enough over the last number of years to see that that has many unintended consequences. Well, thank you. It's a tremendous question, and it's a real problem. I mean, we have laws on the books, and then a lot of those laws are not necessarily being enforced in equitable ways. And you have de facto voter suppression measures going on in certain states around the country. So at the federal level, we want to first enforce the laws that are on the books. That'll actually go a long way. And voting rights are under attack in many jurisdictions. What we have to do is we have to work with the states to try and alleviate those measures. Some of them, unfortunately, are at the state level and not at the federal level. But to the extent the federal government can lend resources and support to the people who are fighting for voter rights, that's exactly what we should do. I'm running for president to help solve the problems that got Donald Trump elected in 2016. And to me, the main driver of his election was that we'd automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, Iowa, all the swing states he needed to win. And how many of you all work in technology? Some of you definitely do. My friends in technology know full well that what we did to the manufacturing workers, we will now do to retail jobs, call center jobs, fast food jobs, and most disastrously, trucking jobs in the years to come. So we need to help America manage the greatest economic and technological transformation in our history, which is what we're in the midst of right now. It got Donald Trump elected. We have to wake people up to the fact that it's not immigrants that are causing these problems. It's an evolving economy and technology's growing ability to push more and more Americans to the sidelines. And that's why I'm proposing universal basic income of $1,000 a month, the freedom dividend, which would help millions of Americans make a more effective transition in this new economy. It would also make us stronger, healthier, mentally healthier, more productive, and would be an enormous catalyst for entrepreneurs around the country. It would create over 2 million new jobs just because we'd all have more money to spend. This is the trickle-up economy, from people, families, and communities up, and this is why I'm running for president. We are going through, again, the greatest economic transformation in the history of our country. And it is not immigrants that are causing these problems, it is technology. The question is, how are we going to start addressing the problems that got Donald Trump elected in 2016? And that is what I am laser focused on doing. Now, my candidacy, if you don't know anything about me, we are at 3% nationwide, and most people have never heard of me. We're raising millions of dollars in increments of only $20 each. So I joke all the time that my fans are cheaper than Bernie's. We're already drawing fans from the conservative part of the political spectrum, Trump voters, libertarians, independents, as well as liberals and progressives. So what I've been saying to the American people, it's not left, it's not right, it's forward, and that's where we have to go.
So some people who might be skeptical of UBI might say, why stop at 1,000? Why not 2,000? Why not 3,000? If the goal is to help people, if it's to cut down on income inequality, why is only 1,000 your number?
Well, I think $1,000 is the perfect starting point because it pushes every American adult up to right below the poverty level. So the poverty level is $12,770 a year per individual. And so if you were a household of 2 adults, you'd be getting $24,000 a year. That's a really big difference maker, but that's also not going to be massively disruptive to our existing labor markets because it's not like any American's going to quit their job on $12,000 a year. I mean, think about it. Anyone here going to quit their job? If you're going to quit your job on $12,000 a year, you must really be itching to quit your job. You know, like that job must be pretty terrible. You'd be like, oh, I can't wait to get out. So you're not going to disrupt the existing economy. It's going to be this incredible boost for many households and many families, but it's not going to be changing everything all at once.
Heidi is asking, will green card holders and non-citizens who are contributing to the U.S. economy be eligible for the Freedom Dividend?
So I have many friends who are in that position, and the Freedom Dividend would initially be available only to citizens. But I'm for a speedy path to citizenship for legal residents and green card holders. And in a way, it's a bigger incentive to become a citizen. That if you become a citizen, then you'll become eligible. And I have many friends who have green cards who've been stuck in this limbo for months and even years because we have this bureaucracy that's backlogged. So the hope would be that we could clear up that backlog as fast as possible. And if green card holders want to become citizens, then we help them do so, and then they would be eligible for the dividend.
Will student loans be forgiven?
So I referred to it a little bit earlier about the fact that we have this immoral mountain of $1.5 trillion in school loans. That's up from less than $100 billion in 1999. Think about that. 20 years, and it went from less than $100 billion to $1.5 trillion. $38K per graduate. And the darkest thing is that if you graduate from college today, there's a 44% chance that you're going to be underemployed and do a job that doesn't require a college degree. So you get this massive debt load, and you graduate into a job market that isn't necessarily rewarding you on that level. So given that context, if you have a choice between hundreds of thousands of young people living in their families' basements, paying off loans, or moving themselves forward, hopefully buying a home, starting a family, starting a business, we should choose the latter. So I am for the forgiveness of the vast majority of the school loans that are out there. I would call it a stimulus of the people. Because we know that by forgiving the student loan debt, a lot of that money is just going to get spent directly in our economy in ways that move us forward.
Discussed a little bit earlier. His question is, some people have a concern that your Freedom Dividend proposal might create inflation in rent prices. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so there are 3 sources of inflation that are driving Americans nuts. And those 3 are housing, education, and healthcare. Those are the big 3. If you look at our consumer prices, they've essentially stayed stable for a while on things like clothing or media or electronics or food for the most part. And so housing is the big one. Now, the great thing is if everyone has $1,000 a month, that goes with you wherever you go. And so right now, a lot of people are somewhat stuck in place because they don't want to move too far away from where they work. But if you have $1,000 that's portable, it makes you much more mobile. And it also means that if 4 of you got together and said, hey, among the 4 of us, we have $4,000 a month. Like that's enough to actually not just be renters, but maybe we could throw down on a property together. Maybe we could pick up a fixer-upper. So there are things that the dividend will do that will actually help with the inequities in the rental market. The tough part about the fact that certain landlords are sticking it to tenants is that a lot of that stuff is local. And the zoning restrictions in many communities are that you can't build affordable housing, and many developers have a much higher incentive to develop fancy apartments rather than apartments that people there can afford. So to the extent the federal government can change those incentives, I would be all for that. But a lot of that's going to come down to the local level with cities and communities trying to make it easier for people to build affordable housing.
Mr. Yang, thank
Hi,
you.
David.
Hi. Serious questions have been raised about the impartiality of many decisions the Federal Reserve's made over several administrations. As such, there have been repeated bipartisan calls for increased transparency through repeal of existing restrictions on the ability of the Comptroller General to comprehensively audit the Fed. Would you support such a bill? And were it to reach your desk as president, would you sign it?
You can put me in the school of thought that the Federal Reserve should be free of the government and depoliticized to the extent possible. And having like this cudgel where it's like, hey, do things that I like, or else we're going to do things that you don't like, strikes me as the wrong approach. There has to be some sort of independence from political considerations, or you would legitimately have presidents just being like, hey, my numbers are down. You know what we need? We need you to lower interest rates so that the economy looks better for my reelection. That's a very dark place to be. So I would be for maintaining Fed independence to the extent possible. Chip's gone, and I have no idea if I'm ever going to get it back. And he voted for Trump, and he was very, very angry. So to me, as someone who's run a business myself, I would also be furious if the prices got changed on me after I spent months or years trying to build a relationship or make investments. And so if we are going to use tariffs, we'd want to use them in a way that people would have a lot of visibility. You wouldn't change the prices in the near term. You would change them literally years down the road and try and use that as a prod to get China to the bargaining table. But I'm convinced that there are better ways to address our concerns with China than tariffs that end up just punishing businesses and workers on both sides of the dispute.
Our jury is clarifying something that we discussed a little bit earlier. His question is, some people have a concern that your freedom dividend proposal might create inflation in rent prices. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so there are three sources of inflation that are driving Americans nuts. And those three are housing, education, and healthcare. Those are the big three. If you look at our consumer prices, they've essentially stayed stable for a while on things like clothing or media or electronics or food for the most part. And so housing is the big one. Now, the great thing is if everyone has $1,000 a month, that goes with you wherever you go. And so right now, a lot of people are somewhat stuck in place because they don't want to move too far away from where they work. But if you have $1,000 that's portable, it makes you much more mobile. And it also means that if 4 of you got together and said, hey, among the 4 of us, we have $4,000 a month. Like, that's enough to actually not just be renters, but maybe we could throw down on a property together. Maybe